We've heard this morning about the introduction to the idea of the responsibility to protect. This afternoon we heard some of the specific recommendations and challenges to operationalizing the responsibility to protect. And this afternoon we're going to look at previous and ongoing international campaigns to see where there might be some lessons learned to help us move along the way more quickly and more efficiently. We're very pleased to have a distinguished panel of guests to speak this afternoon. We're very pleased to have Anita Sharma be the moderator of the panel this afternoon. Anita is the executive director of an organization called Enough, a new initiative of the Center for American Progress and the International Crisis Group. Its goal is to abolish genocide and mass atrocities. So she will be here to moderate this afternoon's panel. Thank you.
Thanks. It's an honor to be here as part of such an illustrious group of leaders on such a critical issue of importance. I think with this panel, we're going to try to bring it down to the operational level. I know we've been talking about operationalizing R2P within the international framework within the United Nations, and then steps the United States government can do, and also as well as the Japanese government and others. But this panel is actually going to look at a movement and whether such a movement relating to R2P, the responsibility to protect, can actually take place and take hold. And if so, what are the steps involved? And through that, we are going to have the panel here that I'll introduce in a moment talk about their experiences and lessons that can be applied to today. Let me first thank the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, Rachel, and I asked her last name, Shugakane, to correct the spelling, Human Rights Watch and the Genocide Intervention Network for bringing us all together. Now, earlier this morning, you heard Gareth Evans talk about some of the challenges to operationalizing the responsibility to protect. And he noted that it was the lack of political will as one of them, and said it should be a source of mobilization, not lamentation. And I think that's what you're really starting to see now. Some 10 years ago, the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, where I got my first start as a researcher, and Gareth Evans was one of the commissioners, really took to heart the failures of Rwanda, the massacres in Srebrenica, which happened underneath the UN watch, and to say that the international community should and must do better to prevent, mitigate conflicts, and work to rebuild. And that's on the cycle of conflict, which we've heard about today. Now, those ideas were further refined in the International Commission of Intervention and State Sovereignty report, and that's where the responsibility to protect really took hold, and as we've been talking about today. But I also think that we're beginning to see not only the creation of legal norms and restructuring norms, but also a constituency, a movement, a social awareness of people who are actively engaged on these issues and really care deeply about preventing mass atrocities wherever and whenever they occur. And last night, after General Dallaire's presentation, several of us were discussing this movement and whether it's actually taking hold, and the type of energy levels that are behind it, and the likelihood that it can gain speed and traction. And I said I was extremely optimistic that this was a very passionate and amazing movement that was not only complementing efforts within kind of the framework of systems, but in many cases was actually leading the charge. And by that I mean the energy that has been created around Darfur, and the efforts of the Save Darfur Coalition, the efforts of the Genocide Intervention Network to really bring together a faith-based organization, student groups, and push the United States government and others to do more. And I think that type of work really needs to continue. And it's not since the anti-apartheid era that you have seen such a broad constituency engaged on an African issue. And perhaps I'm so optimistic because I'm head of a new organization which, as you heard from Camille, has the lofty goal of abolishing genocide and mass atrocities. Now, I won't say too much about Enough other than to let you know that there is folders in the back. We just released our first series of reports aimed at actual policy recommendations that the international community, the United States, and in particularly the activist community can do to be engaged and help stop some of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And by that I mean in Darfur, northern Uganda, and eastern Congo. We employ recommendations on how to protect civilians, promote peacemaking, and punish perpetrators, and do this through a strategy of field analysis, high-level recommendations and advocacy, and also an activism strategy. I'm not sure if I see the person who was here who asked the question on northern Uganda, but let me just say, relating to northern Uganda and the responsibility to protect, in where is it? In the folder, we have strategies and an activist agenda specifically relating to northern Uganda. So if you want to consider ways to operationalize R2P, there are several things that need to happen relating to the 3P framework. So I'll just say quickly, in terms of the peacemaking, that the United States should, because it has a strong relationship with the Ugandan President Museveni, should work to bring about political change and support the political process by sending in a U.S. envoy, which is something that the activist community did to engage on Darfur and was successful. And there is now a U.S. envoy on Darfur. On protection, that the community, the international community and the United States can pressure the Ugandan government to curb its human rights abuses. And on punishment, and this is something that we're going to hear more about relating to the International Criminal Court, Joseph Kony, who is the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, has been indicted by the ICC. And so we can urge for the ICC to continue to pursue those indictments if indeed he does not want to engage on the peace process. I mention that because I think it's very important and critical for us to kind of understand now how R2P can actually take hold, and how you as activists, whether it be through the student community, faith-based community, can push the agenda forward. Now, the panel brings us to the movement question, and as I was saying before, we're here to kind of look at the architecture of several current and past human rights campaigns and the lessons learned from these campaigns, and how they can lend themselves to the new responsibility to protect campaign, and in particularly asking our panelists to discuss the campaign goals, structure, and strategies, and their suggestions for the R2P movement. Let me just, you have their bios, but let me just briefly say a word in what they will be addressing. Kenneth Rutherford is the co-founder of the Landmine Survivors Network, which serves on the coordinating committee on the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which was the recipient of the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize. Ken will offer insights into the creation of LSN, how it helped form and lead the coalition to secure the 1997 Landmine Treaty, and after such a victory, how LSN has evolved over the past decade, and lessons that are applicable to the R2P movement. And Bill Pace is director of the World Federalist Movement and the Institute for Global Policy. Since 1995, he has served as the convener of the NGO Coalition for the International Criminal Court, which is an international network now comprising more than 2,000 organizations. I've asked Bill to discuss in his remarks the challenges of supporting an initiative which does not necessarily enjoy the support of the United States government. Third on the panel is Reverend Gloria White-Hammond, who has been pastor of the Bethel AME Church in Boston since 1997 and is a pediatrician at the South End Community Health Center since 1981. In 2002, she co-founded My Sister's Keeper, a humanitarian women's group that partners with women in Sudan in their efforts toward reconciliation and reconstruction of the communities. And Reverend Gloria will focus on how this new organization is working its campaign goals on a grassroots and grass tops strategy and various coalition efforts. And finally, the newest member, other than enough of these types of social movements, is Mark Hanis, and the executive director of the Genocide Intervention Network, which was created to provide ordinary citizens the tools to prevent and stop genocide. Currently, GINET's work focuses on ending the violence in Darfur, providing material support for the African Union, and peacekeeping in the region, and also organizing political action campaigns for a more robust civilian protection force. Mark will discuss the genesis and creation of this new effort and how the student-led involvement is carving out its own niche and how it is complementing R2P efforts. Now, the panel seems, obviously there are very different goals and strategies and objectives within these campaigns, but I think they're loosely tied together in the theme of the challenges that they've all faced in terms of building support, consensus, and achieving victories on issues that seem very far away or indirectly affect the American people. However, even though those kind of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, several amazing victories have happened. The International Criminal Court was created, and the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty was passed. And indeed, I think it's starting to make the impossible possible, and hopefully we'll be able to take some of those strategies and tactics that were employed by these movements and use that for today. So without further ado, we'll go to the panel, and then we'll open it up for discussions after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share the experiences of the international campaign to ban landmines. It's wonderful for me to be here and sit in the audience, not only as a professor, but as a former humanitarian aid worker who lost both his legs in Somalia. And interesting to hear Somalia in the context of it was a fiasco, it was a disaster, when actually that operation saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And people tend to have the Black Hawk Down version of that operation, which is not true at all. What I'd like to share with you is how and why international campaigns are successful, and provide insights, sort of a cheat sheet or a roadmap on how and why campaigns could be successful. And these are from my personal experiences and some research I've done as being part of the movement. And if you're taking notes, I have 9 items. If you're interested in more detail on some of these items, I could share with you some of my articles or publications. But I'm going to go really fast. I have 10 minutes, so it's about 1 minute for each one. Number one, the landmines campaign was successful for one reason. Primary reason was taking it outside the UN. The consensus voting on disarmament issues in the UN is held hostage by one individual country, which could be one of 180. And for years, people have tried to negotiate the landmine issue in the UN, and it wasn't until October of 1996 when Canada grabbed the landmine issue from the UN and took it out and negotiated it outside the UN, where countries could join on board, sign it without any reservations, and then it was redeposited back in the UN, which would be a very unique case study. This is a model for another weapons issue. I'm wearing a blue bracelet, and I have a cold from Oslo, Norway, 2 weeks ago, where Norway took the cluster munitions issue out of the UN, the CCW, and negotiated in Oslo 2 weeks ago, a declaration where 46 countries signed to agree to ban cluster munitions by 2008. And that would never happen in the UN. It took 5 years in the CCW in Geneva just to negotiate how to discuss cluster munitions in the UN. So that's lesson number one. Now, lesson number two is partnerships. The landmines campaign was not achieved by governments, it was not achieved by NGOs, it was not achieved by the UN. It was achieved by a coalition of over 1,000 non-governmental organizations, individuals such as Princess Diana, Foreign Minister Axworthy of Canada, Senator Leahy of the United States, Nelson Mandela of Africa. These are what I call the 4 moral entrepreneurs in the landmine issue. When Nelson Mandela, in February of 1998, declared that South Africa would ban the production and use of landmines, within 10 days, 12 other black African countries joined the treaty. That shows you how one person can make a difference, and that's just an example. And I'll get back to Princess Diana in a second. On partnerships, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to the international campaign to ban landmines, not for banning landmines, but for creating a new form of international politics, of reaching out to a broad segment of the world's community. They grabbed different organizations from around the world, different skills, and if the R2P is going to be successful, it has to broaden beyond the constituency of this room, or most of us in this room, which leads to number 3, diversity. These NGOs were diverse. There are lawyers or legal experts. Human Rights Watch was huge. Doctors, medical doctors, Physicians for Human Rights. Eric Stover, who I talked to earlier, I quoted him in 1997 congressional testimony on his research. Engineers, soldiers, all these organizations have the best that the world has to offer. Engineers, lawyers, doctors, professors, all gravitating towards this issue. Also on diversity, there was a big push to keep Southern NGOs involved. Africans, Asians, Latin Americans. Personally, I never attended a meeting without an African or Asian colleague by my side. It was not a Eurocentric, it was not an American, it was not a white campaign. It was truly transnational. And inclusion was a very big part of that. It was the North and the South, getting them together, different skills, doctors, lawyers, etc. Another critical issue to the success of the Landmines campaign was evidence-based, actual evidence and research from the field. 3 short examples. One is the difference between an anti-personnel landmine and an anti-tank landmine. The treaty bans anti-personnel landmines. There are people in the campaign who want to ban anti-tank landmines. There are people in the campaign who want to ban anti-personnel landmines. But study after study showed that the greatest threat to non-combatants was anti-personnel landmines. And moreover, that was an easier strategic objective. The idea was to focus on anti-personnel landmines. A second piece of research, evidence-based research, was who are the victims? Over 90% are civilian. More children die from landmines than soldiers during the war. More children die from landmines after the war than soldiers during the war. Eric's research in Cambodia in 1991, a coward's war. I told him, 1 out of every 234 Cambodians is an amputee as a result of a landmine. He was saying he hopes that's right. I quoted that. And that's a shocker when you think that more people have been killed by landmines than chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons combined. If you're losing the audience, you could say that. It's research, it's out there. And third, for example, cluster munitions. I'm transitioning to the Cluster Munitions Coalition. The evidence presented in Oslo by Human Rights Watch and others is that cluster munition itself is a legal weapon of war, but should be banned because of weapons of war. Why? The evidence shows that the major instances of the use of chemical weapons has killed and harmed a majority of civilians in those areas. The U.S. use in Laos, the Israeli use in Lebanon, the NATO's use in Kosovo, and the UN or the U.S. use in Gulf War I. In every single case, those weapons were misused and misapplied. And so that's one of the legal arguments that's being launched out of Oslo, now called the Oslo process, a copycat of the Ottawa process. 5th, technology. When the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded, many people thought that the internet and the email contributed to the international campaign. And this is partially true. It helped build coalitions across borders. You could email a refugee camp in Pakistan with our Afghani colleagues. You could email Africa. It was very cheap, it was low cost, and I like to use Margaret Keegan-Seekin's idea of a boomerang effect. We had a lot of research pouring in from countries with authoritarian governments who didn't want to get on the telephone, couldn't share that information publicly. They gave us the information, and we went back to those governments. So we could circumvent traditional communication forms. Also, we could counter what we call political doublespeak. If we heard a politician or a diplomat give a speech in Oslo, true story, the Australian delegate, who said something who was contrary to the Canberra position, some of our Australian colleagues emailed Canberra, and the next day that delegate gave a different speech or a different statement. Like, this is not what you said here. So it's easier to monitor with NGOs who are usually under-resourced, understaffed, and overworked. And it's low cost. The Landmines campaign was a virtual campaign. But just going back, 1996, a lot of African countries didn't have technology. A lot of government officials don't want to speak on the internet. They want to speak by telephone, go off the record, etc. 4 more, I'm going to skip some. Survivors, what we like to call R2P, the right to participate. The Landmines campaign is the Landmines Weapon Treaty is the only weapons treaty in the world's history to date that has language for victims of that weapon. A big part of it was the Landmine Survivors, the Landmine Survivors Network, who I worked with, Article 6, Paragraph 3. All states in a position to do so will help economically and socially reintegrate their disabled populations. The Disability Rights Treaty, which is going to be signed March 30th, a big role for people with disabilities. Another case, another factor, clear message. Keep it simple, stupid. I think Dallaire said that last night. Ban landmines. It wasn't restrict the use of landmines. It wasn't a different type of landmines. It wasn't under a unique set of circumstances. It's easily translatable in any language. And I have a couple more, but I'll end on another. The last, very important, is selling, what I like to call Madison Avenue. What is marketability to your issue? Why should Americans care? In the U.S., Don Steinberg, who was President Bush's and President Clinton's special representative of landmines, he knows. What we did is we tried to bring American landmine victims from all the different wars in front of the White House, left our artificial legs on the sidewalk, and why not us? Like, why not us, U.S. United States? And from the White House. And the Secret Service had to come and pick up those legs, and that picture was in the Washington Post. And then we had a church dinner that night, remember, Don? At my church in Georgetown, and then Don helped us bring home some of the survivors. Bosnia, Vietnam, Korea. What about England? We had a great opportunity to work with Princess Diana in Bosnia, the last working week of her life. That trip wasn't about Princess Diana. I mean, it wasn't about landmines. It wasn't about landmine victims. We brought her to 5 different landmine victim families, Muslim, Croatian Catholic, Serbian Orthodox. We knew the trip was about her, and the media would follow her. I asked her, I was told to call her Ma'am as in jam, until she corrected me. I said, ma'am, thank you so much for being here. Why are you here? We knew her. We worked with her. She had a lot of options in the world. She said, the media has made my life horrible. So I like to make their life horrible by going to places they normally otherwise wouldn't go to and covering issues they normally otherwise wouldn't cover. At her funeral in early September, my wife and I went, and Jerry White and his wife went to the funeral. You could not buy a flower in London. And we flew directly to Oslo where the treaty was being drafted, and that was the first time publicly that the landmine victim assistance language was included in that treaty. There's a role for victims and survivors. It's beyond being a poster child. That's how we started. We used to bleed over the audience, in the microphone, taken away from us and brought back to our hotel rooms. Afghani, Mozambican, American, it didn't matter if you lost your legs, they still thought you lost your mind. Being used by people with good intentions. But that's where within the movement that the survivors and the victims, and if you listen to the speeches in Oslo, a lot of it was about the victims and survivors. It brings a sense of humanity and compassion to the negotiating hallways. My 10 minutes are up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and it is a real honor to participate in this conference with General Dallaire and Gareth and Juan and other what are world leaders and world-leading non-governmental organizations, and with the students here. I'm always reminded, almost every day, about a quote from, I think, H.G. Wells, that history is a race between catastrophe and education. And so it is vital that we continue to try and plant the seeds for trying to change history with people at the university level and students who we know from many times in the past can make a vital difference in the world. My organization was founded right after World War II in 1947 as an anti-World War III international law peace movement. General Dallaire described last night in very eloquent terms this paradox about the situation between the 80% and the 20%. For my organization, the metaphor is that the Earth is like a very, very large boat where you have occasional groups of passengers drilling holes in the bottom and setting fires to cabins. The boat's police and fire department, the Security Council, however, is a massively dysfunctional department composed and controlled by serial pyromaniacs and bottom drillers who astoundingly make an awful lot of money and power setting fires and drilling holes. In this metaphorical hell, the responsibility to protect may seem like sending sugar water to a heroin-shooting alcoholic and expecting a cure. But in truth, we are all in the same boat, and whether in first class or steerage, we will all sail or sink together. I am here mainly because of the work that, again, had great honor to serve as a convener for a global network of over 2,000 non-governmental organizations working on establishing the International Criminal Court. Beforehand, I did this type of work on campus and at the local community in Denver, Colorado, for 20-some years. Then I had another strange story was the rock and roll department for Amnesty International in London in 1987 and 88. We did a global concert tour on the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. After that, I went into global environmental protection work at the international level and worked on the Earth Summit, which was an extraordinary UN General Assembly conference. But the Malaysian ambassador, Razali, who was I was the NGO counterpart, and we did get it wrong in the way we set up the implementation mechanism afterwards, which was one of the important lessons I learned. The end of the World Conference process at the UN was supposed to be on peace and security in 1999, but the governments, especially the Security Council, refused to let that happen. And in fact, to my mind, the 2005 summit was kind of the delayed peace and security summit and was mostly unsuccessful. In Denver, when I would go to a city council meeting, there would be 30 or 40 of us lobbying the city council that night. And most of them were developers, and there were a few of us that were doing civil rights or inner city preservation or something. You went to the state capitol and there was 500. You went to Washington and there was like 10,000, now there's 100,000. When I went to the legal committee of the Sixth Committee at the General Assembly in 1994, at the time when they released the draft statute for the International Criminal Court, there were 6 of us, and I was actually 2 of the 6 represented that day. And I learned early on that at the international level, the ability of an individual or an individual group to make a difference is so much greater than most people have any idea about. And it is still true today. You could go to the Disarmament Committee, the Legal Committee, the Human Rights Committee, any given day of the week, and you will have just a handful, if that many, non-governmental organizations working on this. And it's one of the lessons. In the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, I just want to mention what the Times of India wrote right after the treaty conference in 1998. Make no mistake about it, this is international lawmaking of historic proportions. Not since the establishment of the UN itself have so many countries voluntarily yielded ground on such a fundamental aspect of state sovereignty. And for the last almost 10 years now, the Rome Treaty has been described as one of the greatest advances of international law in all of history. And to make it succeed as that great advance is one of our primary goals. And again, because I'm at a place, I'm going to mention some of the things achieved. It was done inside the UN system, which was extraordinary, whereas the landmines had to go outside the General Assembly system. It was a court against all predictions, which has inherent jurisdictions over crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, including jurisdictions over crimes occurring in internal conflicts and crimes against humanity committed in times of peace. A court with an independent prosecutor. A new world court with a strong relationship to the United Nations and Security Council, but with protections against improper control of the court by the Security Council, and stringent guarantees against the permanent members using their veto to shield themselves and others. A statute which allows no reservations, a statute which includes the principles of the world's many legal systems, a statute which represents a monumental advance in a global system of laws and international criminal justice. New guarantees for justice for women and children, and historic advances in the protections of the rights of victims. 90% of what we do is educational. I would argue even with the groups, whether it's Greenpeace or Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, 90+% of what we do is educational. We've got to educate people before we can ask them to take a position on this or that. 90% of what we did on the ICC coalition, we started off with the 6th in '94 in November. There was about 25 of us that met in February of 1995, 800 by the time of the Rome Treaty Conference, over 2,000 today. And to this day, we spend 90% of our efforts. We prepare reports, we do research, we do dialogues, we do translations, interpretations. We created a North-South NGO coalition and network. One of the first goals was to get the big powers in the NGO community to cooperate on this together. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, International Commission of Jurists, International Federation of Human Rights, Lawyers Committee, the International Red Cross, and others. We had to have the big groups willing to work together if this thing was going to succeed. And then they agreed to work in a way with the small and middle-sized organizations. The next step was to help foster and encourage a like-minded coalition of governments from the North and the South. You needed to address, you needed a group that went across all of the government grouping lines, the regional grouping lines, Asia, Africa, we all, Western and Western Europe and other groups, East Europe, Latin American and the Caribbean. You need to have countries that were in the non-aligned movement, in the G77, in the OIC, the Organizations of Islamic Conference. And you did this so you could take those groupings' ability to kill the initiative away from them, because they also operate by consensus. So you turn consensus as a way of going forward, not as a way of blocking. We did the same pretty much in responsibility to protect. It was just a very few southern governments that basically stood up and told the non-aligned that they were not going to eliminate R2P in the 2005 summit document. We established a formal partnership between the NGO coalition and the like-minded governments. We worked to develop principles that both could operate on together. Usually ours were more strident than theirs, but we ended up overlapping on about 8 of the 11 principles. We used international organization leadership, in particular Kofi Annan, but mostly we wanted to neutralize the international organizations whose bureaucracies really were very negative towards this effort. And again, use the leadership, but not let the IOs control it. What we ended up having, again, was a coalition of non-governmental organizations from the North and the South, and a coalition of like-minded countries, mostly small and middle power countries from the North and the South, from all of the regions, working together, pushing forward. One of the most important principles that guided us was, let's create a court that is worth having. If we can succeed in getting it started, then we can get it to work. Then the countries, the big powers who are on the outside and the dictatorships on the outside, will spend time to try and bring them in. It is a new approach called new diplomacy. It, I think, remains one of the most important principles for advancing democratic global governance in the world today, and it looks like the Oslo initiative is going in the same direction. You have to have strategies on educating the media, This is a multi-layered challenge, and most NGOs don't take the time to educate the media. They just try and use the media for press releases. But on the ICC, we spent 3 years before there was even a press conference, just meeting with them, explaining, because these are extremely technical, difficult issues. We did the very opposite. We did not want a lady die. This was one of those hallucinatory, Fellini-esque moments at the UN where the lawyers went out of control, and we didn't want their ministers or parliamentarians or the media to find out what they were doing. They were moving forward in an extraordinary way. It was a perfect storm moment. It wouldn't have happened a year earlier. It wouldn't have happened a year after that. It definitely wouldn't have happened a year or two after that. And if we hadn't got the 60 ratifications in 2002, in July, then the Bush administration would have certainly, like the law of the sea, prevented this from coming forward. I don't have any time to reserve the balance of, but I will try and submit to you some written information if you want to look, because we have written about how we organized this effort, and there are some very important lessons. And the last one is this, is that individuals make a huge difference. Individual foreign ministers, whether it was Axworthy or the Dutch foreign minister or Robin Cook, who made an enormous individual contribution, the UK foreign minister, individuals make a huge difference, and then these coalitions, like-minded coalitions of NGOs and governments make the difference. Thank you very much.
I suspect that I'm like many of you. I'm new to this, activism at this level. There are a couple of jobs that I've been trained to do. As a pediatrician, I know how to take care of kids and their families. And as a preacher, I'm prepared on a moment's notice to do 3 things: to preach, pray, and die. So how did I get to this place? I'd like to very briefly share with you a little bit about the history of my involvement in this movement, some of the information about my sister's keeper, and then finally some of my observations about the movement to save Sudan, if you will, that I've learned along the way. First of all, I'm confident that many of you are aware that Darfur does not represent the first genocide in which President Bashir has been involved. There are certainly 2 other genocides. For both of those other genocides, slavery was a byproduct. In 1995, a local group of people in southern Sudan began to develop what eventually became a very elaborate, though controversial, underground railroad to actually identify their loved ones who were enslaved in the north, to either buy them or abduct them, and then eventually to bring them back and to return them to their villages in the south. Again, this was a controversial effort, but at the time, you too, for a mere $33, could have purchased the life of a human being. A cow, on the other hand, would have cost you $100. As a descendant of slaves, I was eager to understand how this system worked, and so I went to Sudan and became active in the anti-slavery movement. As the years were going by and primarily women and children who were enslaved, were returning to their villages, then the question came to me as to what would happen next. And it occurred to me that it was then important to be involved in the third of the 3 prongs that you've heard us talk about relative to the responsibility to protect: the prevention, the intervention, and then what I, as a black preacher, call reinvention. Doesn't that sound good? Prevention, intervention, and reinvention. That'll preach, believe me. And so 4 years ago, I co-founded My Sister's Keeper. We are now 7 women. We're African American, we're Caucasian, we're Sudanese. We all have other jobs, but we basically pulled our Palm Pilots and our ATM cards together to provide support for women and girls in South Sudan and now in Darfur. We've supported several projects in the South, most recently focused on girls' education, because most people understand that the fastest shortcut to developing an entire community is to educate its girls. So in our first year, we had 100 girls. In April, we will start our 4th year, and the community tells us to anticipate 1,000 girls. I just returned from Sudan and introduced the woman that we have hired to one man the construction project and oversee that campus, that new campus. It is apparent that already we have, the school has outgrown our campus. So if someone could call up Oprah and ask her if we could just have a little bit of her lunch money, I think we could build an even bigger school. But again, we've understood that that was important in terms of our responsibility to both prevent, intervene, and then support the reinvention. I've done enough of these kinds of conferences that I've become concerned that oftentimes at the end of them people seem to leave feeling discouraged. And so I have arrived at the place where I despite all the negative stuff that we've heard, am firmly persuaded that history will record that we stopped a genocide, just regular peeps like you and me, working in partnership with the grass tops, sometimes pushing them along, sometimes pulling them along, but I am thoroughly convinced that we will be able to do this. It does require us to adjust our expectations with regard to the timetable, but I'm going to share with you the top 10 reasons why I don't feel no ways tired. And that's what Grandmama used to say when things would look tough. She would say, I don't feel no ways tired. So I don't feel no ways tired. Number one, because we don't have a comprehensive guide to follow. There is no handbook for dummies on how to stop a genocide. We are making it up as we go along. Number two, we are indeed changing a paradigm. You know this, that typically the response to genocide is to see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and therefore do no good. That is a well-entrenched policy, and so it will take quite some time to undo it. That's not an excuse for why it's taking this long, but it is an explanation. And I believe that when the book is written about how we stopped a genocide, it will be a testimony to the fact that it's not always the swift who win the race, but those who persevere. The third reason I ain't no ways tired is because we have to adjust the timetable, because I think you've also understood the chronic and complex nature of Sudan. Again, Darfur does not represent a simple aberration in Bashir's otherwise good behavior. This is the way he does business. And so it is going to take more than a few slogans or an occasional rally to undo the injustice that he is used to doing. There are certainly a growing number of people who understand this. I think that one of the challenges for the movement in its earliest phases is that we did anticipate that if people knew that that would be enough to stop it. We have now, I think, taken time to listen to the experts on Sudan, and not just the ones who have knowledge in their heads, but the ones who have passion in their bellies, to understand that it's really very complex and it will take a while, so we need to adjust our timetables accordingly. The fourth reason that I ain't no ways tired is because the genocide in southern Sudan stopped. It took 20 years, much to President Bush's credit. He was the first international leader to pay attention to southern Sudan. And what I have said to him is that you are not finished, that you have not solved Sudan until you solve Darfur as well. The fifth reason that I ain't no ways tired is because, quite honestly, the Sudanese are not no ways tired. I can tell you this, that on the ground in southern Sudan and in Darfur and throughout the diaspora, the Sudanese are wearied, but they are not dissuaded. They know that their cause is just, and they're continuing to persevere until the genocide is stopped and peace and justice prevails in all Sudan. It remains true, and you've alluded to this, Ken, that historically a successful movement to change the status of a marginalized people is led by those people. I regret that to a large extent, at least in this movement in America, we, and this is a bold statement, but I'm concerned that we have marginalized the people from Darfur and the people from Sudan. So it's my job now is to augment the voices of the Sudanese, and particularly focused on Sudanese women, who are very capable of stating their cause and raising their concerns and making it clear what they think needs to be done. It's also important that you can't save Darfur in isolation from the rest of Sudan. And again, I think that to some extent we have fed into something that Bashir has done very well. One of the reasons that he has managed to stay in control so long is because he subscribed to a divide and conquer philosophy. And so the people in southern Sudan will tell you that many of the soldiers who were involved in their genocide were from Darfur. That means that there are ongoing hostilities between the Darfuris and the southern Sudanese. By focusing on Darfur to the exclusion of the rest of Sudan, again, I think that we have played into that strategy. I see some changes going on here. You cannot deny a person's genocide. So it's very important that we do everything that we can to hear the voices of all of the Sudanese and enlist their support. Ultimately, Sudan needs a regime change. I don't know whether nobody else said that before. I guess they're official policy people. I ain't none of that. And so I'm going to say it, okay? What Sudan needs is a regime change. And again, what we have learned learned in America is that America does not do well with regime changes. And this is something that has to come from within Sudan. And so part of the effort, again, is to equip and support the Sudanese people to come together and figure out what that looks like. My personal goal is for the winners of the Nobel Peace Prize to be from Sudan. The sixth reason that I ain't no ways tired, and you've heard us talk about this already, Kit has alluded to this, is the importance of having a diverse people. I really believe that that we have a wonderful opportunity to create a model for how international people can come together and take on a thorny issue. And the landmines movement is an example of that. But I believe that this movement should be a paradigm of everything that is interrelational, and it's everything and everybody, interracial, interfaith, international, intergenerational. I'm obviously committed to enlisting the support of African Americans. I will know that we will succeed when I can come up here in the Bay Area and see that we got a lot more African Americans up in the mix. And what I say to my African American friends is that we, as people of African descent, have a unique opportunity to make an intervention for African people today, such as was not done for our ancestors 400 years ago. And I'm excited as more African Americans are hearing that and are looking to play a critical role. It's also important to mobilize the voices of moderate Muslims. We cannot do this until their voices are heard, and this would be a critical opportunity for them to find their voices, and having found those voices and speak out about this issue, to then apply that to some of the other thorny issues that impact all of us around the world. It's also important to continue to press the engagement of Africans, not only because of their influence on the African Union, but also because of their influence in China. And again, we can be very creative about how to do that, but we need to figure out how to do that. And then the final two reasons that I don't know how many I'm up to now, but the final two reasons that I ain't no ways tired is because we have, as people in America, have dealt with intractable problems before, and we successfully confronted them. The fact that you see that I am an African-American woman, right? Up in this place with the mic, well-educated, talking about an African issue, suggests that we can do this. And so I say, especially to my female friends, that when I hear them telling me that they're just so discouraged, I say, honey, you must not know what time it is. The fact that we have anything to say about this is a function of the fact that there were some sisters who did not allow themselves to be overwhelmed and to give up. So I ain't no ways tired. And the final reason that I ain't no ways tired is because we quite honestly have not fully unleashed the power of women. And I'm not on a women's power, well, I am on a women's power trip. But that ain't the only reason. It's because, quite honestly, the bulk of the people who have borne the greatest devastation in this war have been women. The people who are keeping the communities together, whether they're in the villages or in the camps, are women. And the people who are poised to do the work of rebuilding are also women. And so, sitting in a group of 20 women from all over Sudan, after a lot of discussion, one woman got up and said, you know, these men started the war, these men maintained the war, and now they don't want to sign a peace agreement. Sisters, it's time for us to take charge. So that's why I ain't no ways tired, and I believe that when history is written, we will discover that this time the revolution will be televised.
Wow, that's tough to follow. So as you can tell, my age, not much of a veteran at this issue either. But I'll give it a shot. So in a famous fax to the United Nations requesting to seize the ammunitions to stop the Rwandan genocide, the author signed it off by saying, if there's a will, there's a way, let's go. That author, of course, is General Dallaire. And those three sentences are critical to understanding how we're really going to help fulfill the responsibility to protect. Specifically because the report actually emphasizes the need for addressing political will. In Samantha Power's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, she repeatedly beats the reader over the head by saying it is in the realm of domestic politics that the fight to end genocide is lost. And so we need to get political, because that's the only way we're going to prevent and stop genocide and mass atrocities. So we've come up, not with 10, but with 3 E's of engagement that we think that you can use the model. We've used the model on trying to stop the genocide in Darfur, and hopefully all of us can use it on R2P. And they are easy, effective, and entertaining. So the easy part is, I've seen many of you on your phones and BlackBerries, is that if you can't get someone to do something in 5 minutes, you're done. You've lost the campaign. People are so pressed for their time and attention that if you can't, they're not going to spend a whole day at a conference to learn about R2P and learn about the conflicts. You must engage them easily, and again, in the 5 minutes or less. The other part is effective. If they are able to give you the 5 minutes out of their time to help out on pushing for social justice and responsibility to protect, you've got to get the maximum bang for their buck. No one wants to waste their time. And so you've got to find the best way they can use that time to be as effective as possible. The last part is entertaining, and my parents and grandparents always felt that they had to do something because they told they had to, or they felt guilty, maybe because they were Jewish. But the thing is that you can stop genocide and have a good time doing it. And Americans are coming out with creative ways. They're either doing dance concerts called Salsa for Sudan, or Dance for Darfur, or Jam for Sudan. So there are ways that you can address all these mass atrocities and genocide and do it by having a good time. So we've come up with what we found as an organization, the 3 most effective tools that every single American can use to prevent and stop genocide, and trying to use it in the 3 E's. And the best part is that they rhyme. Educate, advocate, and donate. So the education part is, as we've heard repeatedly from Bill, you can't stop a genocide if you don't know what's happening. We must become more knowledgeable about what's happening out there. As General Dallaire said, we need to get out there because there's 20% of us here that don't know what's happening with 80% of the world. And so we rely on organizations like International Crisis Group and Human Rights Watch enough to raise awareness. And you've found other initiatives like Invisible Children that are dealing in northern Uganda, spreading awareness through a video, through a DVD. Students and non-students have raised awareness by creating chapters. There's over 700 student chapters across the country are now building it into churches and synagogues to raise awareness about genocide and mass atrocities and the ability to stop it. The donation part is critical because we know we need more humanitarian aid. We need more money for NGOs and international organizations. The United States is years behind in paying its arrears, but fortunately, the grassroots is leading the charge and hopefully leading by example. So you've got the really wealthy, like Ted Turner, giving lots of money to the UN Foundation, or you've got fortunate to have the Omidyars through Humanity United providing lots of funding to NGOs and international organizations. You've also got the grassroots stepping up to the plate. We've had Jam for Sudan, where high school girls raised $3,000 in one night. To help the people of Darfur. You had Cornell University show Hotel Rwanda, and they raised $5,000 in one night. Or even down to smaller levels, where a grandmother wrote to us and said her 10-year-old grandson, instead of wanting a birthday present, wanted her to spend the money that she would have on his birthday present to help protect the people of Darfur. And in our example, we launched a campaign called 100 Days of Action to shame the inaction of 100 days while 1 million Rwandans were slaughtered to death, while the world did nothing, to take action on Darfur. And these grassroots efforts, in 100 days, we were able to raise $250,000 to help protect the people of Darfur. So it is possible for every single individual to have a hand in stopping genocide and fulfilling responsibility to protect. The last tool is advocacy, and this part is absolutely critical because we need to pressure our government to fulfill its responsibility to protect. So we've come up with 3 tools that we think is really effective. The first is congressional scorecards. There's this big black box where all our members of Congress who have the power of the purse and the world's superpower, biggest budget, are making all these decisions on humanitarian aid and peace and funding for peacekeepers and all other post-peace building efforts. And yet they always use excuses of, yeah, I did something, but no one really knows what they did. So we created these scorecards giving a letter grade, A through F, to every single member of Congress, grading them on how have they voted on Darfur, how have they co-sponsored on the legislation, have they been to the area, have they talked to the media, have they spoken at town hall meetings in their own district, anything to help them, to hold them accountable. And we made it really easy for any single American to look up the grade, how we calculated the grade, and then allows them to email their member of Congress saying, I demand nothing less than an A+ from you in response to stopping a genocide. And the response has been unprecedented, where members of Congress themselves are calling us saying, what can I do? What can I do to improve my grade? And some of these members of Congress had a B+. Another one quickly learned what he could do to improve his grade and co-sponsored a piece of legislation, called us back and said, please, change my grade so I can stop getting my constituents calling me, telling me I'm failing in stopping a genocide. So it's critical that we pressure our public officials, especially at the local level, to fulfill their responsibility to protect. Another part is targeted divestments. It costs money to commit genocide, and we know that the business community can help or hurt in stopping mass atrocities. So we've come up with a targeted divestment model where we specifically target the companies in the oil sector that we know are providing 70 to 80% of the military hardware used to exterminate the people of Darfur, and are getting colleges, endowments, state pension plans, mutual funds to ensure that they're not funding these companies. We don't want to fund this genocide. And hopefully all of you know and are proud about the fact that California, starting in the UC system, divested the largest college endowments from these companies in Sudan, and later took it to the next level of divesting the two largest state pension plans in the country, CalSTRS and CalPERS, all because of Californians' leadership. However, many of you know people outside of California. We're trying to get the rest of the country to follow California's lead in passing this targeted divestment legislation. The last part is also something I imagine many of you have seen Hotel Rwanda. Actually, how many of you guys have seen Hotel Rwanda? All right, a good number. So there's that big scene where Don Cheadle plays Paul Rusesabagina, tells all his staff, and says, get on the phone and reach out to the people, let them know that this may be the last time you guys can actually help them stop this genocide. And we've thought creatively and come up with also the most effective tool that it's either on you right now or at least within 1 foot of you that can help stop this genocide, and that's a cell phone. We've created the first anti-genocide hotline called 1-800-GENOCIDE. And what it allows is any single American to call 1-800-GENOCIDE, enter your 5-digit zip code, and we will know who your senators are, representative is, and governor is. And then you can push 1, 2, or 3 for whichever one you want to talk to, and we will give you the most up-to-date talking points, the top 3 up-to-date talking points, for you to be able to say that your constituent and your votes and your campaign dollars count on what that member of Congress does, and then we connect you for free to that congressional office. So each of you can reach out and tell your member and tell your public officials that they can have a hand in stopping genocide. Another just quick example, 3 minutes left, is with Senator Richard Lugar. Last year he was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he determined the agenda on what Darfur bills make it on the agenda and which didn't. And we went to his staff and we said, why is it taking you weeks to months to put in this Darfur bill on the agenda? And his staffer said 2 reasons: numbers, constituents, and money. He said, no one from Indiana is telling me to do anything about Darfur, so I'm not feeling the heat. The other thing is that it's just not a priority for us. We're dealing with Iraq, Iran, China, Syria, Lebanon. Darfur is like 17th on the list. So what we did was we, using technology, got on MySpace and Facebook and Friendster. For those of you that are non-students, those are social networking tools over the internet. And we asked students, rabbis, and priests in Indiana to go together into the district offices and demand that Richard Lugar puts this bill on the agenda. So you can no longer use that excuse of my constituents don't care. The other part is the funding. And as when we start as students, we don't have a lot of money. And if we do, we don't give it to politicians. But based on technology, there's a website called opensecrets.org, and it's all public information of anyone who gives a campaign contribution. So we organized students at Georgetown and George Washington University in DC to go to Open Secrets, and we got the top 200 donors of Richard Lugar for his last campaign. And using their cell phones, these students, some of them after 9 o'clock so they could save on minutes, called the donors and said, hey, did you know there's a genocide in Darfur and you gave $2,000 to Richard Lugar and he's not putting legislation to stop a genocide? And they said, who are you and who is Darfur and what's happening? And so these students explained to them what was happening, how they could play a key role, and 2 weeks, and so they gave them a sample script of what they could do when they called. And 2 weeks after this combination effort of district office visits by American grassroots citizens and students cold calling donors and donors later calling Lugar's office, Senator Lugar put the bill on the agenda and the United States Senate passed the Darfur Peace and Accountability Acts. These are key ways that grassroots efforts, getting political, are able to stop and address mass atrocities and genocide. So in conclusion, if we truly, truly want to fill our responsibility to protect, I would shift General Dallaire's sign-off of that famous message, that famous fax, and say, if you build the political will, there's a way, let's go. Thank you.
I'm not sure why Mark was reluctant to follow Reverend Gloria, because I think he has a lot of preacher in himself. So. And I was thinking of a way to rhyme some of the, to tie the panels together. The first sessions in the morning were optimistic. The one this afternoon was a bit of a pragmatic presentation, and I think this presentation was a fantastic presentation. And so, if that rhymes, but to use a word that doesn't rhyme is determined. And I think that these presentations have really shown just the way that it is possible to employ strategies that bring together a very diverse group of constituents and engage on a whole host of tactics in both kind of the insider, outsider, grassroots, grass top strategy. So I think it shows that not one size fits all, but there are certainly nuggets that we can pull from those campaigns and bring them to the responsibility to protect campaign and bring that forward. One of the things, before we open it up for questions, which I'd like to ask because we didn't get the time for Ken or Bill to address, is the challenges within the campaigns themselves, and particularly within the United States. If you were talking about the successes on the international realm, but also the challenges on the domestic side. I think the campaign in Darfur is a bit of a flip, as Mark was suggesting. It's the kind of the diverse group of people within the United States who are helping to push the agenda, and admittedly on the international side it has not been as strong. But anyway, going back to Ken and Bill, if you can address that briefly.
Go ahead.
You mean the U.S.?
The U.S. reluctance to support the International Criminal Court.
Well, briefly, the United States and the other permanent members never believed the governments would agree to set up the World Court to hold presidents, generals, warlords, and other individually responsible for committing these crimes. They were just certain that once the governments got into it, the French continental law and the British common law and the Arabic law, and that they sent it to the legal committee because they were certain the lawyers would kill the thing. There's no way we could agree to something that doesn't work the way we work. So all the way to the very end, the U.S. policy elites, I think, thought this thing would crash, and then they could create an ad hoc permanent tribunal for the Security Council, and they call it the International Criminal Court. And again, whether Ambassador Sheffer was not keeping them properly informed or was misinformed, he was the U.S. Ambassador for War Crimes, or whatever. The United States and France and China, all the way through the treaty, tried to kill it. But the UK changed when the government changed in June of '97, and Robin Cook individually made a huge difference by subordinating the court to the Security Council off for the United Kingdom. He said, and they joined the like-minded group, the United Kingdom. And then finally, on the last night, France sold the U.S. and Russia and China out and joined the group. So we don't have any place where we have more NGOs in the United States working for support for the ICC and trying to change the policy difference. Basically, the Clinton administration's was kind of soft opposition. I think they thought all the way to the end they could negotiate a change that would be acceptable to them. And even when they lost it, Clinton, in one of his last acts, wished it had been his last act instead of the corrupt pardons, but was to sign the Rome Treaty on the last day of the year, and a Sunday, 3 feet of snow on December 31st, 2000. The Bush administration fortunately took them, as it always does, takes about a year to get your government into place and ratified by the Senate, et cetera. And of course, 9/11 occurred, and so by the time they geared up, we had gotten the 60 ratifications. We used the U.S. opposition to get the ratifications. The most powerful argument to many countries to ratify was the U.S. was opposed to this. And but we weren't anti-U.S. I think all of us are completely committed over time that it's important to have the United States in. My own personal belief is that it's one of the great achievements that small and middle powers are demonstrating. They can set up a new international organization. It's the general theory is that you need to have U.S. financial and political leadership to set up anything and to do anything. And you still hear that nonsense repeated all the time on CNN and everywhere else. Well, it won't happen if the U.S. doesn't do it. That's not true. And so I think it's important to set it up, make it work, show that it can work, and then pressure the big powers to come in. It is a different way of reforming them than most have thought about, but it will be an effective way. And the key here is, as my colleagues at the table have said, is just to keep the pressure on to get people in college, in city councils, in state legislatures, because by the time they get to Congress, you can't change them one iota. It's like a heroin addict. Literally, there's no way they're going to change their position. So you've got to get them early on, and otherwise you've got to do the power politics. But this combination of grassroots up and then international law down, I think, is the strategy.
On the landmine case, it's unique in the sense that the U.S. was the world's leader in restricting the use of landmines. 1991, 1992, the U.S. became the first country to unilaterally ban the export of landmines, 100-0 in the U.S. Senate, the first country in the world. 1993, they made it permanent, 100-0. By 1994, the U.S. ceased becoming the leader. And an interesting question is, why did the U.S. not sign this treaty? 2 independent borders, 2 oceans, it's a $3 weapon, world's deepest military arsenal. Why didn't you sign it? And depending on who you ask, there's 5 different reasons. The other major powers didn't sign, so why should we sign? I had a Pentagon lawyer tell me if Rwanda and Nepal bans navies tomorrow, the U.S. is not going to ban their navy. We're a major power, act responsibly. Number 2 is the usual suspects didn't sign, Korea, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, that was used. Another was Clinton. Clinton didn't have a military background. His wife wanted him to ban the landmines, Princess Diana, the Nobel Peace Prize. Everything was set for Clinton to ban the weapon, but he didn't have some of the respect in the military. The only Republican in his cabinet was Secretary of Defense Cohen. He didn't want to lose that bipartisanship. And he could not do what FDR did in World War II, which is tell the Army, you will not use chemical weapons island hopping to Japan. The Army wanted to use it to flush out the Japanese. This weapon is inhumane. He didn't do that. But the real reason is legal, probably, is because the U.S., if you sign a document, they believe that if you ban this weapon for humanitarian reasons, it will create a legal slippery slope, which would mean that all our weapons are under legal inspection. And the U.S. has never banned a weapon that has a utility in the battlefield. And landmines has a utility in the battlefield, and if you ban this weapon for humanitarian reasons. And an interesting part is the U.S. has not used landmines since the early 1990s, stopped producing landmines in 1999, and part of the treaty is taking mines out of the ground and victim assistance, and the U.S. has given more money to help victims to take mines out of the ground, depending on human measurement, than all the 150 countries who signed and ratified the treaty put together. In effect, the U.S. is following the treaty more than most, and they won't sign it. Which leads me to just one story, Convention on Disability Rights, which is being signed at the United Nations in the Geneva room on March 30th in New York. It's taking this, some of this country, the Americans with Disabilities Act International. The U.S. will not sign. In 2002, had a meeting with the U.S. diplomats at the UN and with the U.S. NGOs, and they said the following. The U.S., we have good news and bad news for you on this treaty. And they said the good news is the U.S. will not actively oppose it. And the bad news is the U.S. won't sign it. Even though what's coming out of the UN on March 30th is weaker than the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's a whole nother lecture. But the point is that there's a law coming out on March 30th. The U.S. will not sign, even though it does not negatively impact the economic interests or security interests of the U.S.
The last part, I think, too, is that the Bush administration launched a 3-pronged war against the ICC, bilateral treaties, a war in the Security Council, and already now, after 3 years, countries have stopped. They won't sign these treaties. Their parliaments won't approve the treaties that the executive has signed. And in November, finally, President Bush signed 21 waivers on the treaties. And then secondly, the Security Council resolution that they forced right before the treaty entered into force was repealed after one-year term. So we can win just by playing their own game, because when, as I said, as the middle and small powers working together are equal to a superpower when they hang together. When they allow the big powers to pick them off, then we're in trouble.
You know, there's always a blessing and a curse about going last on a panel. The blessing is that you get to pull together the various panel presentations from the earlier ones and try to synthesize it. The curse is that you sometimes lose your audience, which I'm very happy to see wasn't the case, but you always run out of time, which is the case. Unfortunately, I thought we were going until 4:45. I had an earlier agenda, and we're actually supposed to finish at 4:30, so Juan Mendez can now take the stage. What I'd like to propose is that if you have questions, that you can kind of meet us on the side or in the back, because I'm sure you have questions not only for Ken and Bill, who actually got a chance to respond, but also for Mark and Reverend Gloria as well. But please join me in thanking the panelists and